We all fall down. This innocent children's game is in fact a grim reminder of the Black Death, the plague that decimated the populations of Europe and Asia in the 14th century. There was no defense against it. Entire villages were wiped out. The medieval social system was virtually destroyed. It was the end of an era. Two 200 years later, the Aztecs and the Incas were to suffer a similar fate. They might possibly have resisted the Spanish conquistadores, but they had no defense against the allies these invaders unwittingly brought with them, smallpox and measles. In 60 years, 90% of the Mexican population, some 27 million people, died. Humanity was helpless. In ancient China, however, they had observed that people who inhaled smallpox pustules were immunized against the disease. They had stumbled on a principle that would become known centuries later as vaccination. It was not until the 18th century that an Englishman, Edward Jenner, took the first major stride towards vaccination as we know it today. He had noted that milkmaids infected with cowpox, a mild disease transmitted by cows, seemed immune to the related but far deadlier infection of smallpox. As an experiment, he inoculated a boy with a discharge from a cowpox pustule. The result was a breakthrough for preventive medicine. The boy was later exposed to smallpox infection and found to be immune. The age of vaccination had begun. Almost a century later, Louis Pasteur, the great French scientist, achieved spectacular success against rabies by injecting suspensions of progressively weaker virus. Modern vaccination works on the same principle as these first experiments, but now we know much more about it. Most vaccines use a weakened or attenuated strain of a given microorganism, usually a virus. The human immune system recognizes proteins called antigens on the surface of the virus. It then creates appropriate antibodies. The body is constantly under attack from viruses, bacteria, and other disease-causing agents. The antibodies induced by the vaccine act like a standing army, ready to defend the body against the invaders at a moment's notice. In industrialized countries, infectious diseases now account for no more than 1 to 2% of total deaths. This dramatic progress has been made possible with the help of mass vaccination. In 1966, the World Health Organization launched an ambitious drive to eradicate smallpox, a disease once known as the most dreadful scourge of the human race. By 1979, the WHO had succeeded in eliminating the disease from the face of the earth. There is no evidence that it will ever return. Down through the years, vaccination has proved a powerful tool with which to tackle other infectious diseases, such as measles, whooping cough, neonatal tetanus, poliomyelitis, diphtheria, and tuberculosis. Known to health professionals as the Big Six, these diseases still kill 4 million children a year and leave the same number crippled, mentally or physically. 800,000 infant lives are saved each year by mass vaccination programs, but much remains to be done. Too many children are dying unnecessarily. So the WHO has launched its expanded program on immunization to protect all the world's children against the Big Six by 1990. This is part of its overall program to achieve health for all by the year 2000. One of the reasons for the success of vaccination is that it is highly cost-effective. For the cost of treating a single child with tuberculosis in a developing country, we could vaccinate 7,000 children against the disease. A measles vaccination program in the United States in 1983 saved $12 for every dollar spent, a total saving of $5.1 billion over the first 20 years of the measles immunization program. For mumps, the figures are even more impressive. Against that background, consider the relief from suffering, pain, and death, and the benefits of vaccination are beyond price. Progress with vaccination for smallpox, measles, and polio was helped by the fact that the viruses can be isolated and then multiplied in the laboratory using tissue culture. They can then be killed or attenuated and used for vaccines. Unfortunately, one of the world's major killers, the hepatitis B virus, cannot be grown in this fashion. For a long time, there was no preventive treatment against a disease which kills 2 million people a year, is the major cause of liver cancer, and infects a quarter of the world's population. Then, in the 1970s, researchers realized that it was possible to isolate the surface antigen from the blood of chronic hepatitis B sufferers. The purified antigen is an effective vaccine. However, vaccine made from carriers' blood was expensive, of limited supply, and perceived as dangerous. The solution was to produce the vaccine by genetic engineering, a pioneering advance that met with widespread acclaim and provided the first safe, effective weapon of unlimited supply against hepatitis B. To produce the genetically engineered vaccine, the DNA, or genetic code of the harmless hepatitis B antigen, is integrated into ordinary baker's yeast. The yeast then reproduces in the normal way, except that the DNA instructs the yeast to reproduce the antigen as well. The antigens are then extracted from the yeast and purified. This was a discovery of tremendous importance to world health. Hepatitis B is transmitted by blood-to-blood or sexual contact. It is much more virulent than AIDS. It is endemic in the Far East and Africa. There especially, children become chronically infected and are likely to die in the prime of life. It is also on the increase in the Western world, where certain groups are particularly at risk. As hepatitis B is linked with liver cancer, the world now has its first anti-cancer vaccine. In most countries, health authorities have recognized the importance of hepatitis B prevention. We asked some major opinion leaders from Asia, Latin America, and Europe to tell us briefly their personal experience concerning hepatitis B vaccination. A mass vaccination program has been started in Taiwan. They have started vaccinating neonates of hepatitis B surface antigen carrier mothers, as Professor Sung explains here, and are now including other groups.
A nationwide immunization program has been started in 1984. In 1984, we started to immunize newborn babies born to surface antigen positive mothers, and 2 years later, in 1986, all the newborn babies will be immunized, and after 1987, all children, preschool children, susceptible to hepatitis B virus infection and susceptible medical personnel will be recruited.
Los casos que van a pasar a las fases crónicas.
Sometimes patients have to leave their professions, as in the case of dentists or surgeons who have transmitted the disease to their patients. This has dramatic social and economic consequences.
In Mexico, we have now the recombinant vaccine, and therefore we are in a position of being able to recommend vaccination to high-risk groups. These high-risk groups include, as I mentioned before, all the professional people who come into contact with blood products, or the general population who comes into contact with blood products. I also mentioned to you that we're a population of youngsters, and it is my personal opinion that this vaccine should be given to the young people who, as the years come by, will be at more and more risk of developing the chronic forms of the disease.
Hay que tener en cuenta que existen vacunas.
First-generation vaccines were prepared from plasma. Some people were reluctant to be vaccinated due to fears of contracting diseases transmitted or potentially transmitted by blood or derivatives. By this I mean AIDS, and the acceptance levels of these first vaccines were somewhat lower. A number of other vaccines were tested, but there are now vaccines based on recombinant genetic techniques. With these recombinant genetic vaccines, there is no doubt that the level of acceptance has increased enormously. In our area, acceptance levels of around 92 to 95% were observed in people to whom the vaccine was offered. Humanity is now in a position to eliminate another great scourge. Extensive use of the anti-hepatitis B vaccine could save millions of lives. The introduction of genetically engineered antigens is a major advance in man's fight against disease, another stride along that path discovered by the ancient Chinese and first explored by Edward Jenner 200 years ago.